Hi everybody, Noelani here. Some of you might also know me by my artist name, MONRXE.
Noelani is a singer-songwriter raised in Meanjin, Brisbane, but currently based in Naarm, Melbourne. In a former life, she was an international high-end runway and editorial model. But in recent years, she's reinvented herself to become a fixture of Naarm's underground R&B scene under the name MONRXE. She's also evolved into a fierce champion for representation and education across gender and race intersectionalities. She is a committee member for Black Music Alliance Australia. It's a non-for-profit that advocates for education, equity and representation of black music and culture from the African diaspora within the Australian music industry. She also works with One of One, another non-for-profit organisation that empowers women and gender non-conforming people within Australian music. Noelani is obviously driven by a desire to make the music industry more accessible to marginalised communities, championing safe spaces of mutual respect, equality, diversity and authenticity. We met just a few weeks ago when we both took part in Green Music Australia's Climate Leadership Retreat. I was blown away by her warmth, good humour and no bullshit directness. She's also one hell of a singer. I had to get her on here for a deeper chat. Why make music? This conversation was recorded in October 2024. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the custodians and traditional owners of the land where I live and work. One more note before we start. Noelani's views expressed in this conversation are her own, and they do not necessarily reflect the views of the various organisations that she's associated with. Well, Noelani.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
This is 100% a excuse for me to get you to know you better because we met. Yes, because we met like, what was it? Maybe 3 weeks ago?
3 weeks ago. Yeah, 3 weeks ago. Yep, in Sound Country in Tassie by Green Music. That was far out. What a beautiful moment. Like time stopped. I did not want to leave at all.
Have you tried? I mean, people have been asking me, how did it go? Or even like some people have asked, like, what was it? And I've struggled to articulate it without going into like a half-hour diatribe.
Yeah. How do you package that up? I would definitely say just understanding the systemic learning tools on how policies and politics works with environmental issues and how to implement it as an artist, considering the reach that all of us as creatives have on our own individual platforms, such as like, I guess, was it stealth activism, the way we do music videos or the way we curate our reflection that we put out to the public. But not only that, just getting connected to country, which was a really, really big one for me personally.
Yeah.
Because like I've got an Indigenous mix, but not of Australian, more from the Fijian Islands. And so sometimes when you're on different lands, it feels like, should I be here? And just having that connection and learning that was that you're more than welcome to be here. But also being able to see the similarities between like Palawa country and the way their people do things, and then the way I recognize my culture do things. I was like, wow, we're literally like distant cousins. Like that was real special. Yeah.
It was like we were all there, like 20 artists.
Yeah. Was it 20?
20-ish, or maybe even not quite 20.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
But there was a lot of us, all different areas too, which is what I liked.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, and when I've been telling people I went on an artist leadership retreat, I've had a couple of people go, are you an artist? I was like, what? I don't know. I qualified somehow, I guess.
It's subjective, in the eye of the beholder. So yes, you are an artist.
I have a band camp. Does that make me an artist? But yeah, I mean, so like ostensibly we were there, like you say, to like learn about advocacy, activism, how to do it in the music space, how to connect to each other. But it was beautiful that we spent almost the entire first day talking about country, a wonderful welcome to country on Palawa land. Nadala Barker from Green Music Australia leading us deep into the weeds, like a 2-hour conversation about ancestry and identity and country, like was so powerful. You know, it's that thing where often at these things, not that I've done heaps of them, but I have done a couple of like retreats or workshops or where you go away for a few days and you bond or you try and learn. And yeah, often the first thing you do is you go around the circle and everybody introduces themselves like, yep, I'm a musician, I make hip hop, I'm a producer.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm a singer, I come from Newcastle. Like, and everyone defines themselves by their like artistic practice.
That's what
whatever.
I thought it was going to be, but it was no, what's your family history? What do you recognize about the land you're on? Where's the land you're on as well? But like it was, I kind of really enjoyed that. The whole thing, I guess we didn't really talk about music. Well, like as what we do individually, it was more about how we're using activism in different pockets of areas in the industry we are, which is what I really liked. Because, sometimes it's just like music, but it's like, no, I'm here to learn about doing things that are separate, that make me as a whole person that's separate to my brand as an artist.
Yep.
And then how can I meld those? Like that was just... Yeah, that's probably the one thing I really loved. It was really refreshing because it was like, we're here to learn about something really crucial. This is the focus. And then what you do with it is is up to you. But, I think that's what I really enjoyed, the in-depth conversations.
I'm also just a big believer in like tight-knit small groups of people doing things, whether they live in the same community, which is often the case, and in some ways often the easiest way to build community is just to do it with the people that you live near.
Yeah.
But even if it is across, the entire continent, we've made this little group of the people that were at that workshop, those 4 days, and already get the sense that like we're going to keep bumping into each other and building things and trying things, and it's just like having a little gang in the world. Yeah, it's a WhatsApp group, it's a Zoom call, and now it's a podcast. Because you are the first of what will probably be many guests from that.
Oh, perfect!
That really
I was
special
wondering,
week.
I'm like, am I the first one? Like,
yes. But well, so. Yeah, we had to talk about that first because it was a very like transformative personal experience that we went through together, and I'm still processing it.
Yeah, sure right? It hasn't quite like fully sunk in, and it's like, oh yeah, I did that. And just my brain, it was just so overloaded. I kind of wish we had just one more day just so we can just sit on the land and just like really take it in. But it was the perfect mix, like having the bit of breaks where we can intermingle with each other, and it's like, all right, let's go back into learning, establishing what we do and how these steps are effective in doing environmental activism.
Yeah. Well, we're here now. This podcast is called Why Make Music?
Okay.
And it's essentially, we can talk about anything, but to some degree it's about chatting about why music is important in really difficult times or just in strange times where it feels like we've just been on a 4-day climate retreat learning about the fact that even though the climate crisis is urgent and we all need to be urgently working towards it, there is a place for music to happen as part of that movement.
Yeah.
That's just one part of the kind of conversations I'd like to get to. But a good place to start, and for us, because I'm curious, is... what's your earliest memories of music, like in the house as a kid? You mentioned your families come from all parts of different parts of the world. Like what was the melting pot musically growing up?
It was all over the place. So I mainly grew up with my mum. So my mum is Fijian, Chinese, Tongan. So there's a lot of music in those cultures, or go to any island church or reunion, everyone's singing in harmony, and someone brings out a guitar, like it's about to go off.
Right.
But my dad is African American as well, so earliest memory, I actually have a pretty good memory going back. Like, I would say maybe early, yeah, I would have been just younger than one. I hadn't turned one. And I have a really vague memory of Salt and Pepper playing. And I think it was Push
You
It.
weren't even one.
I
Hang
wasn't
on.
even one. I remember I
Okay.
remember being like in my mum's bedroom and being near the bed, and there was a radio that was just on the window ledge, and it was Salt and Pepper going, "Ooh, baby, baby, baby." And that's what I remember. That's my vivid memory. And then starting to sing because I went to church as well. So I remember, like, as a family, we would go fly kites out in Adelaide, out in the Oval near our home. And I'll be there singing and conducting with a stick I found, singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or something. So those are my
Amazing.
earliest memories.
Yeah. Was your mum musical at all?
Yeah, so my mum was like choir director of church as well.
Yeah.
But she was also a classically trained pianist and also played flute and sang as
Oh,
well.
wow.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
a lot. Everyone in our family. And then my stepdad played saxophone. I played sax, did a bit of clarinet and a bit of flute because woodwinds are all kind of pretty similar. And yeah, sang as well, but never really took it seriously until I moved to Melbourne.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hang on. Before we get to that, so talk me through this. So you're playing all these instruments and you're playing in church? Yeah?
So all
Or
those I was playing in bands. So I did
in bands? Okay.
yeah, I did band. So I also got into like really hard to get school camps, like music
Yep.
camps, with other schools around the state. And this is when I moved to Queensland. And I was, yeah, pretty musically inclined, but obviously in island culture, a lot of people play music. It's because that's part of our heritage, but the option to pursue music as a career is kind of frowned upon.
Interesting.
It's like, go become a doctor, go be a lawyer, go do this. But I kept just, it's one of those things where it's always been in my heart, and I've always pushed it away because of that expectation of being like, it's very difficult to break in the industry. And yeah, it just, when I came to Melbourne, I just found myself being pivoted to groups of people. Everyone I met were musicians. And so I started like hanging out with them, and they would have their bands and they would jam. And it was probably a good 3 years before I actually decided to get up there with them and perform. And then everyone's like, "What? You can sing?" Blah, blah, blah. Like, what is this? And
Yeah. You
and I'm
can
like,
sing, by
yeah.
the way. Can testify. I saw you busting out karaoke at the Green Music Retreat. I think you did Salt and Pepper Push It, didn't? Or we all did, really. So
I think we all did.
we all did.
Yeah, we were going pretty.
yeah. So hang on, I'm trying to get this just for because I'm nerding out a
Yes.
little bit here.
Go
But
ahead.
so Adelaide to Brisbane to Melbourne.
So Adelaide, I was there till I was 5.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay.
1 year in Canberra, and then the rest up in Queensland.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And then when did you move to Melbourne?
Going on 10 years now.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And then so even like as a teenager or like young adult, whatever you want, like that period of time where you're playing in bands, I guess.
Yeah, so I was still playing in bands, but I
Yeah.
was kind of losing my love for music because I guess the education system in music up there just wasn't quite right. I went to a very multicultural school, but
Yep.
who was heavily, heavily underfunded, particularly the
Right.
music department. And I particularly went to that school was because during primary school, my music teacher also taught there at the high school.
Right. Okay.
And she's the one that really pushed and inspired me to do music and had me auditioning and doing the AMEBs and all of this stuff. She really saw a drive in me and something in me. And then when I got to high school, she unfortunately left. She had to move. She got married, so she moved up to Sunshine Coast. And I guess we had such a high rotation of music teachers who you can tell weren't passionate
Right.
in the music side. It was more to, I guess, live in the matrix for a day-to-day 9 to 5 job type thing. And it was kind of disheartening because it's like, damn, this is what I want to do with my life. So
Yeah, not every music teacher is like Mr. Holland's Opus. Have you ever seen that?
No,
Mr. Holland's
I
Opus?
haven't.
Oh, it's a crazy
Then
movie from the 90s where Richard Dreyfuss plays this like inspirational music teacher. It's like Dead Poets Society, but music.
Okay, can you send that to me? I would love to watch that.
Well, you wouldn't. It's not great. It's just me throwing in an old man reference in the middle of your anecdote. But yeah, I mean,
not like
it's
Whiplash, like that was so full on, like.
Yeah. But like you and I love music, and so
Yeah.
sometimes it can be hard to imagine that a music teacher wouldn't just be an inspirational, inspired figure because your job is to teach music. How wonderful is that?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
teaching can be a grind. Not everyone
Yeah.
actually loves teaching. Not everyone's really built to be a teacher, but sometimes they end up
That's
doing
what
it.
it was. Like
Yeah.
I found that a lot of the things that I was doing in primary school, even the books, because I was excelling ahead. Like I was when I was like in the junior band, I was actually put up into the senior band with 2 years above because of where I was
Yeah.
musically. And then I get to high school and they're playing the exact same songs that I played in primary school with the senior band. They're teaching from textbooks that I was given by my teacher that I already had at home, word for word. And it was like, well, how are you meant to engage children and spark that desire if you're just writing word for word? It was kind of heartbreaking. So I lost that love of music. I did try to continue it, but by the time I was in year 12, I was just done because we just did not have the facilities or necessarily like the funding at my school to do it. But when I finished school, I was doing film, so doing extra work on Terra Nova, which was Steven Spielberg's dinosaur TV show.
That's right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was doing that on the Gold Coast. I did some extra work with Slide, which was like, I think it was meant to be our version of Skins. I think that's it. I think that's what it's called. That was
Yep,
in the
I remember
UK.
Skins.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it
think
was
so,
our
yeah.
version of that. And then I actually ended up got into Hairspray and got to perform that as one of the Dynamites and one of the black classroom mates. And that was the musical. So that was at QPAC. And that was a sold out season. So I guess that was kind of when I was like, oh, I'll give it a go, and then got in. And I was like, yeah, this is dope.
Yeah.
But yeah, I actually ended up mainly getting into fashion. So I was modeling for quite a while. Modeled here, got to do fashion weeks, ended up going to the US and doing modeling over there. And I was doing really well until I entered a TV show called The Face Australia. So, just a
No,
lot.
I don't know that. I actually don't know that show, although I know it only through looking at your socials.
On my
but
socials,
This is a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal because it
Yeah.
had Naomi Campbell on it. I got in, and it was very brutal, the blowback. I essentially had one bad photo, and all models have many bad photos in a shot, but you had one shot to do a photo. But there was a lot of really bad duty of care behind the scenes, a lot of racial microaggressions. And when you have no energy and nothing, you put everything into it. And unfortunately, I just went a bit too hard on that and had put out a bad photo, and they over dramatized it and put out an edit that, massive climax of music and everything.
Yeah.
And, gave me a bad edit. So I ended up getting blacklisted from the Australian fashion industry.
What?
Yeah, for one bad photo. And the
Oh.
thing that's annoying is I did the runway challenge, which was the second challenge, and I won my runway challenge. And that's even bigger for me than a photo because Naomi Campbell is the queen of the runway. But Australia had the only version of that show that did not show the runway challenge. So it made me look completely incompetent because I couldn't nail the photo. But But yeah, got blacklisted, lost my agency, lost contracts to go overseas, all the labels, clothing labels, photographers, everything, all the networks I'd set up over a good 5 years was gone like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's brutal. Like that is the kind of brutal story you hear about reality television. Although probably a lot of people watching reality television don't actually hear those stories; they just watch the show and it's entertaining.
exactly.
But so we'll get back to music. But so your relationship with fashion at that point, as you were going into the face, were you like, was it a real core passion identity thing for you, or was it more just a job? Or because like if you were in that mindset of like, I'm a model, that's what I
Yeah.
love and that's what I'm excellent at, to go through a situation like that
Yeah.
can be really
Yeah.
really difficult.
Yeah, it was more like I definitely really wanted. I think a lot of people don't realize I did modeling in the hopes to get into music
Right.
because modeling and like the fashion industry and music really they actually meld together quite a lot actually. So I was hoping, maybe I'll be modeling and then I meet someone that's like a producer or a label head or something, and then I'll get into music that way. That was the big plan. But even just the creativity of it is the one thing I really loved about. So I definitely knew I wanted to be in some form of creative arts. The blacklisting was kind of just hard because if I wasn't a dark person, realistically, I don't think the blowback would have been different. Look at the situation where I get one bad photo, win a runway challenge, doesn't get edited, and I'm cancelled forever. And then you've got someone like Raygun, who is getting media appearances on the project, rubbing shoulders with billionaires for centering in a culture that essentially isn't hers, and who has the education, has the privilege to have the education to understand the in-depth levels. So I think definitely because we don't have like a precedent of a treaty here in Australia, because of that, we can't acknowledge First Nations, and we have no ability of acknowledging anyone that is actually a victim of systemic racism.
Yeah.
If I was like a Becky or or a Sarah or something, and I looked like a lot of models on the books that are reflected compared to being one of 20 models competing for one job, usually back then, at least.
Right.
And with a unique name and a massive afro, like I definitely stood out. So people were like, oh, yeah, you're that girl. So it definitely gave me an insight to, I guess, like a shake up on actually realizing the systemization of everything and how that plays out. And I guess that's kind of how I was forcibly pivoted to music. But then at the end of the day, I guess it was my calling, because music has always been something I've wanted to do really deep down. But when it's like, oh, you can't have a music career, and when you lose everything, it really makes you really connect to the spirit of where you are. And so being new in Melbourne, knowing nobody, and just starting to see patterns of where I was falling, and now being properly in the music industry now, it's just like, oh, this was one door closed for a reason. It was meant to happen. So
Yeah.
I'm actually living my dream right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, when you go through something like that, which very much is systemic racism, but, you feel very, very personally, intensely the brunt of it.
Yeah.
And then as you say, that feeling of kind of like, okay, I've sort of lost everything. Does that sort of mutate into I now have nothing to lose? And plus, because
Absolutely.
you've gone through that process, because now you're working with the Black Music Alliance, you're
Yeah.
working with One of One, you were at the Green Music Australia retreat,
Yeah.
like you're now allying yourself with all of these kind of activist movements, which at their core have a deep a passionate commitment to telling it like it is and calling stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, I get the sense you probably always have had a bit of that strength about you.
Yeah.
But did that really kind of crystallize a bit after that, going through that experience?
It really did. I guess it was more the ego death because, you know, you built a confidence in yourself to get to a certain point and then you crash. Like, I actually hit it pretty hard. Like, I was struggling with depression. I actually went into psychosis for a bit as well, because I was partying so hard. Like, because every belief system and mainframe that I had built for myself to make me feel confident as a black woman in a predominant white industry of fashion in Australia was completely disheveled. It was gone. My identity that I had built was gone. So it was a massive ego death and a really, really rough couple of years after that. You know, struggling with anxiety. I was a heavy partier, let's just say. But then during those times, it also gave me, I would say, like, my mind was decolonized in a very brutal way, because I reckon if I did not go through what I did, I would not necessarily be able to understand all the multi-layers of it, and which is why it's been such a huge passion for me now to really start bringing accountability to these types of systems, because we're in, you know, it's 2024. It's too late. You've had civil rights movements that happen in the States. You know, you've had, and then the ridiculous thing about, you know, the stolen generations ending after civil rights, like here, it tells you that we have such a massive elephant in the room and no one really wants to tackle it. And unfortunately, those who have lost everything or those who have gone through something that makes them realize how the systems work, puts a light under your fire to do that work for those in the community who may not be ready just yet. And yeah, I guess that's why I'm passionate about one of one, you know, advocating for women and GNC people. I don't necessarily call myself a feminist. I call myself a humanist, because even in the feminist movements, there is still definitely a imbalance of privilege between those who may have white privilege compared to those who are systemized. So I would love to advocate to bring those together, bridge that gap, and then we can take on like the patriarchy and all of that. That, because, you know, you can't necessarily make change divided. And then Black Music Alliance, pretty much they're incredible. Like, I've always been pretty vocal about things I've seen in the industry, and they reached out to me, let's have a chat about it. And they were like, you know, the reason why it was done was not only to advocate, but also to help protect those who are going out on advocacy alone to not be at risk of being blackballed. And I never had that support when it happened in the fashion industry. Everything left. So to find such an incredible organisation that's driven in the education, the advocacy, but also protecting those that are at risk, essentially,
So
was such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, for those who don't know Black Music Alliance, like, can you sort of describe how long has it existed in Australia, and how is it set up?
I think Black Music Alliance, so I recently joined earlier this year, but started talking to them last year when I met them at Big Sound.
Yeah.
But I think they've been around about 2-3 years now.
Yeah.
So very, very fresh. And it was just seeing a need. So all those that are on the committee are all from different areas. So publishing, DSPs, music labels and artists like myself. And a lot in Sydney, and myself and Enford Jones are the ones here in Naarm. So it was just, they've come about, they definitely saw the education gap, which was the big thing here in Australia. You know, Australian music, there's a habit in the industry where you'll see a lot of people that don't understand the history of particular genres that come from the African diaspora. And it will kind of be the way they're marketed and taking up space in those, as opposed to those who are of the culture, who should technically be dominating those genres, are dressing in the black aesthetic, they're tanning themselves dark to make them look a bit racially ambiguous. When we've got such an incredible black music scene here. The unfortunate thing is that it's regulated down to the underground scene. So if you know, you know, and you don't necessarily see those that can actually make the rules and take the charge of the industry and have true, authentic power. You don't really see them go into those spaces. So essentially that's what Beamer hopes to do, is to shed light that we've got these incredible artists here. You know, why spend $300 bringing massive artists, black artists from overseas, while at the same time neglecting those that are from marginalised communities and their music scene here. We have the potential to have a wide reach of artists just like the American ones. But if you're not investing in it, not only that, not putting, I guess, a preconceived racial bias on what you think it should look like instead of listening to the actual community, I think we could actually be a true threat as a music industry here in Australia, for the better, honestly. Definitely. So that's what Beamer does. So education's the main format, and as well as equity, having black artists be able to take control of the ownership of their artistry, but not only that, the importance of labels or anyone that has black artists to see the importance of reinvesting that into marginalised communities and diversifying their books, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yourself and Enfa are a pretty formidable duo to be representing Black Music Alliance in
Enfa's a legend.
Yeah.
Absolute icon. Good old cool-out son, and he does a lot of activism as well himself. To not only that, just to me be involved with Black Music Alliance, because I'm still very, very much emerging, and to be someone that has established and also is recognised globally and is toured with like people like Odyssey around the world and stuff is just mind-blowing. He's a busy man.
Yeah, and I think there's something... It's complex, hey, because like I think it's really important for like all groups of people, but especially historically marginalised groups of people, to not necessarily rely on the existing structures and the existing system to make space for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this came up a bit when we were at the Green Music Retreat, talking about how, yes, systemic reform is important. Like, okay, like one thing Green Music Australia should be looking at doing and are doing is encouraging the existing music industry, capital I, to implement sustainable practices, you know, stop using plastic water bottles, encourage public transport to gigs, like those kind of things, yes. But that actually there's also an element to activism which is about acknowledging, like play in the space and try and make change happen, but also acknowledge that you sort of just need to create your own other thing over here.
Yeah.
And, you know, like an organisation like Black Music Alliance faces maybe similar challenges and opportunities.
As a Black woman, you don't see things that reflect you is really hard. But even harder when you see genres that have come from your culture, like, you know, me being half African American, I think a lot of people in Australia don't realise these genres have come out of the most horrific chattel slavery in the modern age. You know, even though there was slavery all throughout the diaspora, you know, the UK, what happened in America, they took it to a complete another level. Like, you know, they were making human leather, lynching, forced breeding farms, even forced breeding against own family members. And so the thing that kept us along, because we weren't allowed to talk to each other when we first came over, everything was through a series of rhythms, and that's how everything was dismantled: spirituality, language, our family groups torn apart. So as a culture, we had to start from the beginning. So starting with rhythms, things we remembered the creation of the banjo, because there was remembrance of stories passed down generation to generation of a Western instrument, stringed instrument that was similar. And then you have things that were born out of it. You know, you had your spirituals, you had your blues, bluegrass, country music, going into more modern things, R&B, rock, and seeing that here in Australia and just not seeing anyone that looked like me represented in those genres made me really, really, really upset. It absolutely broke me, because, you know, there was so many elements where I guess, you know, everyone has imposter syndrome, and we are a product of our environment, but seeing some of the acts it was almost like cosplaying blackness without doing their own thing. Like, you know, black culture's given so much to the world. A lot of us being forcibly taken and not reinvested into our communities. And, you know, the least you can do is we love it when people participate in our culture, but do it respectfully. And you know what? Do your own version of it. Do your own individual story. Don't just like carbon copy and paste artists that already exist. And that was a really hard thing. There was some artists I did see that are not of the culture who were dropping N-bombs, which was very interesting to see. It was very uncomfortable, with the braids, the aesthetic, baggy pants, even just the mannerisms and everything. It's like, this is not part of your culture. Like, it's a minstrel show. It's cosplaying blackface without outright blackface.
So everything you just said, it made me think it made me think a lot. But it made me think of a few things. Like, I find myself more and more like coming back to this idea of like an interconnected network of small groups and small communities, and the power that happens when everybody kind of gets their crew together, because you're coming together around a shared passion or a shared belief system or value or ancestry or whatever it might be. And how a lot of the time we're looking for these massive structures or these umbrella organizations and institutions to look after everyone. Whereas there's a certain power in kind of going, well, our thing is we're going to represent and amplify the African diaspora in Australian music. That's our very specific thing. And it's a really important thing. And then there is also this other group that is trying to amplify First Nations artists, you know, Australian First Nations artists. And those two groups coming together because they have a lot in common. They have some things not in common, right? But there's enough in common that they can collaborate on a specific project. And maybe even more than that, more other projects. Like, I'm really fascinated by, I think we're going to see more and more of that just in society, full stop, let alone music, in the coming years, as people realise the power of those smaller groups. And then aligning groups, and it being okay if you've got slightly different views, like, but as long as you can find enough common ground, you can get something going in a more like interdependent way, which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it is like, but it is a great shift of thinking to start thinking about like, okay, well, how can my crew and your crew find something to do together where we both get a lot out of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to tick every box for both of us or something, you know, like there's a lot of power there, and it's a much more authentic way of organising where you don't have to pretend that you have this big thing that works for everyone, because it's just not realistic, like, necessarily.
Well, there's
it's
like
a bit
so
more
much
of a
power in it, you know, like there's so much power in numbers, and the reality is there's a lot of people that are just hustling in the industry on their own, but who may not know, hey, there's safe spaces for you. So that's what I'm really passionate about, is finding those people that have gone out alone like me and felt lost in the machine of it all. But because there is that, what you're saying, that common ground and awareness. It's like, I see you.
Yeah.
I see you. Like, let's collab, let's hang together, let's start slowly just chipping away and opening the door for so many other people that feel the same with us, because a lot of artists definitely go through this a sense of where do I belong. And even, I guess, more so for marginalised communities, especially when the majority of the country does not reflect who you are as a culture. So, little baby steps.
The other thing I got thinking about is it's going to be tricky, but I'm going to try and like think or talk my way through it. But,
Go ahead.
So
I'm all ears.
yeah, let's go. So so this idea that so much of our like modern contemporary music, its ancestry does come, a lot of it from the era of slavery, from Africans in America. Like a lot of the way that we think about harmony and melody and the way songs are structured go back to that time. And it is a time of great tragedy, and a lot of that music at the time was as a direct outcome or a direct reaction of processing that tragedy. So it's really deeply affecting when you talk about it, because you personally identify with that ancestry.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And so when you think about your ancestors, you can tap into a like ancestral line that goes back to that time. You know, potentially through your dad, right? So of course it's like incredibly personal for you when you see that, right?
Yeah.
So to take it back to the retreat, we were talking at the start that on that first day we were all challenged to introduce ourselves in the context of what's our relationship to the country that we're on, what have we noticed about it, but also we were all asked to talk about specifically our ancestry. And so we had such a wonderfully diverse group of people in the room, and everyone went around and was so vulnerable and transparent, talking about
that was such
their
a deep
people,
moment.
you know, and the cultures that they identify with,
Yeah.
and their parents, and further back their ancestral lines. And I was one of the last people to speak, and
You were sitting next to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was obvious to you and everyone, but I was pretty nervous to talk about that because, and I think I talked about, I'm pretty sure I did talk about that awkwardness because I'm a white Australian, right? Mm-hmm. And my ancestry, as far as I know, I don't know a lot about my ancestry.
Yeah.
Like I know that a couple of 100 years ago, my ancestors invaded this country and claimed it. And I now live on these lands, you know. And beyond that, I guess there is an ancestry in Europe that I feel not connected to, and if anything, embarrassed by. Like my ancestors were an imperial force, you know, like in Star Wars, right? Like the bad guys in Star Wars. So, you know, like, and I'm trying to be careful here because like none of this is like meant to be said as excusing behaviour.
Don't be careful. I totally
Yeah. So this is kind of like, it makes me think about Australia, right? Yeah. So Australia and Australian music in the 90s and noughties, right? Hip hop in particular was potentially really obvious to some, but invisible to most people, that Australian hip hop was in this kind of racial crisis where you had a lot of white Australian artists making hip hop, and there were a lot of non-white Australian artists making hip hop but not getting opportunities. And there was some of those artists were acknowledging the history of the genre and how deeply tied it was to, you know, hip hop is fundamentally the music of marginalised cultures. It's a music that proudly has been co-opted again and again by people who are struggling, you know, under the weight of oppression. This is like an identifying core feature of hip hop.
Yeah.
And but because Australia, I think because so many of us in Australia, and when I say us, I guess I'm saying, you know, settler, colonial, white descendants, we don't have an identity. Like we don't have an ancestry that we can actually really own with any pride, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that means in some ways, that means that we then disconnect from the kind of personal feeling you have. Like you are passionate and emotional as you should be when you think about this, whereas I think many kind of white musicians, probably even to this day, wouldn't immediately access the same emotion because we don't have our ancestry is ill-defined. You know what I mean? And so what's required instead is education, like you said. Like
exactly.
Just telling these stories, making sure people understand them, and then just empathy, you know, like to somehow kind of like push empathy up the chain of things that we should be having that we should be internalizing as humans, so that, you know, we all feel compelled to learn these stories and then inhabit them. I'm never going to fully inhabit that, potentially never going to fully inhabit that tragic ancestry or complicated history or in the same way, because it's not mine. But if I can have a deep empathy for it, that will deeply affect my behavior and what the choices I make, the kinds of acknowledgements I make about, you know, I mean, even in dance music's had a bit of continuing to have a bit of a reckoning, a much more compressed recent reckoning, where like house and techno, born in Chicago and Detroit, in African American clubs, in queer clubs a lot of the time. So it's like those. So pretty much all dance music, like anything that you love, like that is like rave and jungle and drum and bass.
Anything with rhythm.
Yeah, like, and that's right. So it's just a more recent chapter in this like systemic kind of innovation, often coming from communities that are marginalised, and then it being commodified, commercialised, mainstreamized, whitewashed, and you know, I think we're getting better talking about this and addressing it all, I think, but it's never going to feel urgent or quick enough, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, especially like 2016 is when Black Lives Matter happened, and the amount of labels and artists I saw here putting up their black squares, and then the conversation still not continuing to happen.
Yep.
And which is why I'm pretty like direct and straightforward when I have these conversations, because it's too late. We are so far down. And, you know, for myself as a Black woman, I don't have the privilege of avoiding identity, because essentially when you've got 400 years compounding of generational slavery, rape, whippings, lynching, all this stuff, it actually completely changes the future generations on the way their bodies and their DNA is. Trauma actually changes and rewires the brain. So I feel things very, very heavy and deeply that are connected to my lineage, because I've just had continual, perpetual, generational trauma. And so I find, like, to answer your question, and, you know, Australia, besides having that breakaway of, you know, we've left the British UK, you know, they kicked us out because, you know, I guess we're criminals or all that, and we had to start again. You know, it's hard because you kind of think you'd have the form of empathy, like the system would have some form of empathy, because that's why you were taken out of the UK. But then at the same time, it's hard because there is that colonizer mentality, entitlement to take without giving back. I think there was one point we were talking at Green Music, is that, you know, the systems that have been around, there's been economies that have thrived for so long, predating like UK colonization, where cultures were bartering and trading amongst each other. You know, Mansa Musa taking education and gold and mathematics, science, astrology from Africa up into Europe. You had the Moors going into places like Italy, and who were mingling with the royal families there and who were actually part of the royal families there. You had the Vikings going and trading with Native Americans, trading produce there. The Islanders, we've got stories of us trading here to Australia, and Australia going, those here, you know, on so-called Australia going up into Asia and trading. And it's just always been like a mutual respect of, you know, recognizing that we were guests on the land and having I guess a good discourse for people. And then somehow the UK decides to just, hey, we've given you all this stuff. Now we think we're better than you. And then we're just going to shoot you while your back's turned and, start taking over places. And so I think I totally get the identity of like this country has no culture, because that's the truth. It's a mix of everything. I find, especially here in Melbourne, you definitely recognise the melting pot of where the influences are. But I think, yeah, definitely like for Australia, I feel Australia is so young as a country that we have such a unique perspective where we can observe what has gone wrong in other countries. You look at the mess that America's in right now, you look at the mess that UK is right now, Europe is in right now. And this is the thing that just baffles me. How are we not learning from all these really established countries when you don't take those precautions to firstly get a treaty, and then not, and in turn also recognize those that are minorities. Like the idea of neo-Nazis existing in Australia is so baffling to me. Like, how? But yeah, it's the education component, and empathy does play a way. But when you're, I guess, in a position of power in numbers and privilege, entitlement is a huge thing, and it is also a very instinctual human thing to want to just take, and get to what's yours. But then it's it's survival of the fittest, and it doesn't always have to be that way because you have all these First Nations, Indigenous cultures around the world, predating colonization, that saw that we all survive together in harmony together. And not only that, we learn from each other a lot more effectively, which is why, for environmental activism, if those, I made a point to the artists when we were having that deep chat of how you can battle systemization. The best way of battling systemization is by helping use your position to open the door for us marginalised folks, because we have, our cultures still have the preservation of environmental, being caretakers of the environment. We have all of that knowledge, all that wealth. Despite everything, our cultures have still managed to survive. And you bring that in, you bring all that knowledge with it. And that makes it so much easier because there's comfort in numbers. The numbers are diverse, and the numbers also can teach each other different ways of, I guess, breaking down systems that should be completely reformed. But there's, I totally get what you mean.
Yeah.
But just educate, empathy, and if you're going to participate in Black culture, do it good, do it respectfully, and not only that, when you are, if you benefit from privilege and get into a position that should be for someone that is of a marginalised community that does it better, say something, use your voice. And a lot of people are shy to use their voice because they don't know how it works with PR, how their labels will react to it. But that's the start of it. Us as marginalised communities have to use that voice. We do not have that privilege to choose. It just is. Just like gender identity, myself, people will see I'm a Black person before I am a woman. So I don't have that choice. And if people can understand that, allies understand that, man, the industry could be wild, absolutely wild, and just like the most lit place. Like, seriously.
It's
It'd be like Coachella every day
Yeah.
in the music industry if we actually had these type of conversations and the education. But imagine what can go outside the music industry if people had that insight and perspective and can recognize that, hey, this is how things can get done. Yeah, I think Australia, well, so-called Australia until the treaty is signed, could definitely be a very, very beautiful place. But no one wants to confront the elephant in the room, and that is the unconscious racism, but that is because we have no treaty. It sets the precedent for everything, everything that comes to do with diversity.
Yeah, I think there is like many people, I'm trying to stay optimistic, which even the word doesn't rings hollow now when I say it out loud. But I'm trying to cling to or imagine optimistic futures, because if you can't imagine something good in the future, then you can't work towards it. You have to. And I do like the idea of a version of so-called Australia, where we kind of really come to terms with the fact that the project was toxic to begin with, and that we actively embrace our First Nations as the First Nations people of Australia. You cannot speak for them. You can't generalize and say all of these different cultures and all these different worldviews all believe this. But I do. There is a lot of respect and there feels like a deep respect for the land, connection to the land, and also an openness to bring all of us on the continent together. If there can be a vision of Australia where we are actually led by that culture, and that we can all feel kind of quite authentically connected to it in some way, that is good for the planet. That will transform our climate policy. That will give, we might not even call it Australia. Sometimes I find myself saying to my daughters, by the time you're an adult, at some point in your adult life, I think we'll probably change the flag. We'll probably change the anthem. But we might even change the name of this country. Yeah. Our, brethren in New Zealand are doing that. It's not going to be called New Zealand for very much longer, really, I don't think. So, It can sometimes seem unimaginable from where we are, but in some ways I sort of have to imagine that different version of our nation or our land can exist in the future, and as you said, take those baby steps.
Yeah, it absolutely can, and it's definitely the ego. Everyone's got an ego.
Yeah. No.
Even though I had even though I had my dramatic ego death, which completely stripped everything of me, I still definitely am very proud of where I am, and the hustle. I never gave up. But if everyone essentially checked their ego for a position and just stopped and looked around and really took it in, I honestly think the industry, the music industry in particular, can completely reform everything within 5 years.
Wow.
It's possible, but it takes everyone, and that's the problem.
Yep.
There's a group. We saw what happened at the Women Music Awards and the backlash of that conversation, but there's a mentality that is still very much capitalistic, and also misogynist. And
do you mind doubling back on that? Because I might have missed that.
You missed that?
Yeah.
It was
what
happened last week. There's an article. I'll link it to you. But essentially, there was a panel of men having to sit down about allyship between men and the relationship between women. This was at the Australian Women in Music Awards. Last week in Meanjin, and what happened was one of them, I'm not going to name who, you can read who, pretty much said that the cause of women pretty much saying that women getting assaulted and sexually assaulted and harassed in the music industry is based on the way they dress.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And someone that's actually quite high up in the industry. I guess it's almost you got there are generations that exist that are so holding on to the monarchy, but we have no need for it at all. It's kind of the same thing. But there are a lot more people I definitely see in the industry that are doing the work. It's not perfect, but it's a starting point. But unfortunately, there is a particular generation that is still very much in a top position that either needs to go because, they're still having quite stubborn views of things. But, I reckon if we all united on this and actually really started having the hard intersectional conversations at these panels and keynotes we love to put on so much, but the results of them is not necessarily coming out. So it's like, why bother? But no one ever wants to get to the root of the truth, and it is about addressing the intersectionality of it all. And once you do, people's like, oh, I've been thinking that too. The amount of conversations I have with people, and then they're like, oh, I've been thinking this.
Yeah.
And then but no one ever confirms it for me. And then it's like, we're having these conversations in private. We're having these all the time. Now let's actually do it like on the platform. Let's have a serious, open conversation to the industry openly. And then I reckon like in 5 years it could really, truly change. But it takes numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you say that, I mean, I need to read up on exactly what happened, but when you say it, like one way to create change is just to give that old guard the microphone more often. and have them say crazy shit so that the rest of us can go, see, we thought that they thought that, and they do. Yeah, so can we get this change happening?
Exactly. That's why I'm just like...
Just give them some rope, basically.
It's kind of like a blessing in disguise, right?
Yeah.
Cancel culture, I think it is kind of an important thing to have. Yes. Sometimes it goes a bit overboard, but there is a necessity for it. And it's like, mate, you just removed your mask and showed everyone who you are. So it'll be interesting to see what comes from that, but it's real fresh. And, I had quite a few people reaching out to me because I didn't go, and then told me, and then someone I knew back in the day from Brisbane wrote an article about it, and I was like, oh, no. Okay. How's this exist?
Yeah. And that is definitely a thing if you do, and there's, I don't really know what I'm trying to say here, but I guess like if you do spend a lot of your time at that community level and you surround yourself with other advocates and everyone's really like, you've got all the same kind of shared worldviews, it can be a bit of a shock when you realize that some of those outdated, antiquated ways of seeing the relationship between men and women or all genders, or between, like, some people just have not thought about all this stuff as much as you and I, and they're often the ones driving the bus or, flying the plane of the industry, and you kind of like, you kind of forget.
They've never had to be challenged. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. They've never had to be challenged. And privilege, that's how it works.
Yeah.
You got the privilege to be able to deny people.
To not have to think about it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's not even on your radar. And if you're not exposed to it, how can you truly make change?
Yeah.
Not only that is most people don't want to make the internal change. Some people like to jump out of the matrix for a bit and you're like, oh, this is too much. And then they will make the decision to go back into it because it's too confronting. And you need to find like-minded people that are willing to truly change, because ego death is literally breaking down your environment, your morals you had for yourself, and really assessing. But there's a lot of us around.
Yep.
We just got to find each other. That's the thing.
It's not so bad outside the matrix.
I'm slowly finding them.
It's all right. It's okay.
We were all on retreat in Tassie.
And if you're listening to this, you're one of us now as well. Welcome. Noelani, thank you. Just thanks so much. What a lovely chat. And
no, thank you so much for having me. I was so excited. You're like, do you want to be on this? I'm like, yes, of course. Of course, mate.
I'm just looking forward to getting to know you even better in the years to come, and I'm glad to have met you. So thank you.
We've got a lifelong friendship and a very unique bond for the rest of our lives. So
Awesome.
I'm very excited to catch up outside the tech.